Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan and I officially now have a vitamin D deficiency. When I was a kid, I remembered playing the Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. This was an RPG style game, so you had a squad that you had to equip with armor and weapons. One thing that always bothered me and that seemed out of place was how heavily all of the characters depended on melee weapons. I'm not talking about just Force-sensitive individuals, but also regular people who had to be equipped with vibro blades and clubs. If you really think about it, if you give the average person some melee weapons training, it doesn't necessarily mean they'll be effective in combat. Most likely, they'll just be flailing around blindly trying to hit whatever is in front of them. I mean, seriously, just look at modern day full contact melee battles. It looks more like linemen hitting each other than it does sword fighting like we see in the movies. So when Obi-Wan Kenobi describes lightsabers as
not as clumsy or random as a blaster, an elegant weapon for a more civilized age,
he's probably not talking about you and me. I imagine if someone like myself took a lightsaber, I would end up, accidentally cutting off my own hand or something. And then there's all of the PTSD I'm assuming you'll get from hacking or bludgeoning another living being to death with your bare hands. It's up close and very intimate and most likely will haunt you for the rest of your days. Unless you're in a religious cult that justifies any action as long as you are not emotionally attached to the situation. So melee weapons are difficult to use, they require tons of training, and even if you do end up being successful at taking your enemy down, it will cause mental anguish. Which is why ultimately blasters and range weapons are not barbaric, Obi-Wan Kenobi. They're actually far more elegant and clean to use, which is why it's always confusing when we do see melee weapons in Star Wars. So today I want to take a look at why the Star Wars galaxy has taken this huge leap backwards in civility and technology, and why we even see melee weapons around at all in this sci-fi universe. For most of human history, melee weapons and range weapons balance each other out. Slings, javelins, bows, and crossbows were able to dominate the battlefield from time to time, but they were never effective enough to completely wipe out the use of cheap infantry armed with melee weapons. This had to do with the firing rate, range, and damage projectiles could do versus how fast the enemy can move and how much damage their armor or shields could absorb. But then gunpowder entered the game. It became more efficient and eventually gave one individual the ability to incapacitate dozens of melee-armed enemy fighters within seconds. Even with advances in anti-ballistic materials like Kevlar and composite material trauma plates, it's not like we see modern-day soldiers on the battlefield running around with knives trying to stab each other. It just rarely ever happens. In Star Wars, range weapons like blasters and slug throwers are deadly, but technological advances in armor have leveled the playing field. In Knights of the Old Republic, personal body shields were quite popular and could afford you limited protection from projectiles. As blaster technology increased and the weapons became more powerful, it became more rare to see personal body shields that were protective enough. But you still would see them in very expensive high-end armor like the Katarn system worn by Clone Republic commandos. Then you had certain materials like Beskar or Mandalorian armor, which could actually deflect multiple incoming blaster rounds and still afford the wearer a decent amount of mobility. When there's parity between offenses and defenses, it's clear that individuals on the battlefield will try to find new innovative ways to kill each other. In this case, maybe it's melee weapons. With a galaxy as large as the one we see in Star Wars, you're going to have millions and millions of life forms existing alongside each other with different levels of technology and different types of civilization. If you're on Tatooine, for instance, and you have a modern blaster rifle, you'll immediately have an advantage over the local Tusken Raiders, who generally rely on gaffy sticks and the occasional slug thrower. A brave Tatooine homesteader with an E11 and a pile of Tabana gas cartridges should be able to hold back an entire tribe of these savages. Then you have species like the Gamorreans, who are also quite primitive and backwards, but were lifted up by more high-tech societies and hired out as bodyguards and muscle for criminal organizations. These criminal organizations have access to a wide range of blasters, yet Gamorreans still prefer to use axes and clubs instead of pistols and rifles. This actually makes the Gamorreans piss-poor bodyguards if you think about it, and since the Hutts always use Gamorreans, it makes me question just how competent they were as well. Maybe just having pig aliens with giant axes and clubs is a deterrent on its own. Who knows? Now, I'm not going to say that the Gamorreans are culturally driven to use melee weapons because that'd be assuming, whatever pigsty of a society they've created is actually culture. But there were warrior cultures that were specifically focused on using melee weapons over ranged weapons. The Ikani were a near-human species that surrounded their entire culture around martial arts and hand-to-hand combat. The Ikani believed that you could only really get to know someone by fighting them in hand-to-hand combat, which I guess kind of makes sense. You see, hand-to-hand combat was not only seen as self-defense, but as a form of self-expression. The Ikani would serve as high-valued mercenaries all across the galaxy and rival the Mandalorians in their ability and efficiency. They generally went into battle wielding limited range weapons and enjoyed using electro staffs and vibroblades while wearing light armor with personal energy shields. If you take a look at Palpatine's Royal Guard, they are heavily inspired by the Ikani fighting technique and culture. Now, before we talked a little about why Jedi and Sith use lightsabers. They have superhuman abilities that allow them to dominate the battlefield no matter what kind of weapons they use. And more importantly, thanks to their precognitive abilities, they are able to deflect all incoming blaster rounds. Some more skilled individuals could even reflect blaster bolts at enemy targets. And so what we'll see time and time again is that opposing factions to the Sith or Jedi will use melee-equipped soldiers to basically negate their blaster bolt deflecting abilities. The IG-100 Magna Guard droid used by the Separatist Alliance posed a huge threat for the Jedi, far more than ranged droids like the B-1, B-2, or even the Droidekas. In Jedi Fallen Order, most of the Imperial Scout troopers that encounter Cal Kestis choose to use their stun batons rather than have their own blaster bolts deflected back into their face. Then you had the Imperial Purge troopers led by Darth Vader and his Inquisitors. It wasn't rare for these Jedi hunting clones to use electro staffs, electro batons, and even electro hammers. And these aren't just sticks with little tasers on them, guys. The electricity at the end of these weapons are designed to stop a human's heart after just one strike. This is a pretty lethal weapon. Lastly, we have this idea of boarding ships and having combat on those ships. No one really looks forward to these types of situations because a misplaced blaster bolt can go through a transparent steel window and all of a sudden everyone is being sucked out into vacuum. Now, I'm kind of surprised we don't see more melee weapons being used on ship battles. It seems kind of irresponsible to be just blindly aiming your rifle at any direction. It's an elegant workaround when compared to the alternative, which can cause everyone involved in the situation to lose. Now, regardless of what reason you might choose to explain your use of a melee weapon in a Star Wars galaxy, the one common factor that all these melee fighters share is that they're badasses. Sure, they might not be the smartest or most rational people alive, but thanks to their craziness, it does give us an amazing spectacle to watch on the big screen. So I guess that's the whole point, right? I mean, it looks good, and not everyone is into just people hiding behind cover shooting at each other. Some people want parrying and dueling and, counterattacks and all that cool stuff you get with melee battles. Let me know in the comment section below what you think about melee battles in Star Wars. Should they exist or should they not? And as usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.